come together. You and me come together right now for all the world to see. Come together.
Hello, I'm Shelby Spain, and we're here at the Oren Dunn Museum. You'll soon get a tour of this historic museum, but first, what is Black History? Black History Month was originally celebrated for a week to teach Black history in public schools. This was the idea of Carter G. Woodson, who thought that people should be educated about Black history and culture in 1926. President Gerald Ford officially recognized February as Black History Month in the year 1976. Black history is the honoring of Black excellence and achievements to show the prominence of African Americans from the beginning to today. THS Voices is a club at Tupelo High School. They do several performances throughout the year at school and in the community. Their beautiful voices will sing Better Days. Thank you for the great selection, THS Voices. Tupelo has had many monumental moments that have contributed to Black history. In the early part of the 20th century, Tupelo had its very own Harlem Renaissance on a street many are familiar with, Green Street. It served as a social spot for African Americans to open restaurants, barbershops, stores, and churches. Spring Hill is one of the oldest surviving churches in Tupelo. This church was the starting point of the civil rights marches of 1976 and 1979. The Spring Hill Church provided a safe place for African Americans and citizens to come together to share political awareness and encouragement for the civil rights movement. The Oren Dunn Museum is known to many Tupelo residents. The museum displays the history of Tupelo's cultural background and is also home to the Veterans Museum. The staff of the Oren Dunn has agreed to give us a tour to show us part of Tupelo's past.
This is how Carver School was built. It's so cool. Back in the late 20s, the city council voted to hire an African-American school teacher to teach African-American kids because schools were segregated then. So then they decided to build a school, to build Carver School. And so he told them, he said, okay, every student, every day, should bring a brick a day. And they took those bricks and they built what was Carver School. Now, it didn't look like that. It looked more like this, but you can see the outline. In 1965, the Tupelo schools desegregated. In other words, children who were going to separate schools, black and white, were given the option to change schools. One of the first people to do this was Frank Dowsing Jr. Frank was an outstanding student and athlete, and he was the first, one of three who went over in '65 to Tupelo High School and was the first standout football player at Tupelo High School. Mississippi State noticed him and recruited him, and he was the first one of the first two at Mississippi State University to be recruited. Sorry. This is such a lovely story. We're standing in front of photos from the 1936 tornado that almost wiped out Tupelo, but was also the birth of the Tupelo spirit. You can see here the some African American men looking for survivors. The tornado, which was an EF5, cut across Tupelo and hit what we know as Park Hill now. And a lot of the houses were blown into a pond that was below, named Gum Pond. That's why you have Gumtree Park, because that is where Gum Pond was. A lot of those houses still had people in them when they blew off the hill. Back during Jim Crow days, mainstream, if you will, newspapers did not report African American happenings, deaths, births, social news, marriages. Instead, it was only the terrific, horrific news that was published in the newspapers. But fortunately, there was a weekly out of Chicago called the Chicago Defender. And it had a correspondent in those days in Tupelo. And we were able to find pages of the correspondence that, for the first time 2 years ago, we were able to show the names of some of the dead from the tornado. This is very important. Well, in 1964, there was a big drive to save Park Hill because it had diminished. People had moved out, businesses were pulling out, and Reverend Jameson came along and joined with other members of the Park Hill community and helped push the city to revitalize Park Hill. He was a leader, and he was a very gentle man. And I know during this segment you have seen many, many banners. All of these people are local, and all of these people tell a story of Tupelo and Tupelo's Black history.
Thank you for the tour. Patricia Neely-Dorsey is a well-renowned poet and author. She's also a Tupelo High graduate. She's most known for her books Reflections of Mississippi, Meet My Mississippi, and Mississippi and Me. She has prepared some words of wisdom.
I'll be reading some poems from my book, Reflections of a Mississippi Magnolia and My Magnolia Memories and Musings. They are stories of my life in Tupelo in Mississippi. And one of the first ones is Country Doctor. My dad was the first person who introduced me to poetry and made me have a love of poetry. So I'll start with him. My dad is a part of Tupelo history. He was the third African-American Black doctor who came to Tupelo, and he was the first Black doctor that was able to admit patients to the North Mississippi Medical Center and have full hospital privileges. So I'm very proud of that. And Dr. James H. Nealy. Country doctor, and I call it country doctor because he used to go all out in the country, Morville and Shannon, just all everywhere, and he would make house calls even up until his 1999, which is almost unheard of. My dad was a country doctor, and I have such memories galore. I even remember the house calls as he literally traveled around door to door. Sometimes on Saturday mornings when I was just a young thing, my daddy would let me go with him as he did all his doctoring. He'd have his black bag in one hand and his stethoscope wrapped around his neck. He was most definitely the captain, and I was his first man on deck. We traveled way deep in the country, and there was always such sights to see. Believe you me, I noticed them all, down to the last bumblebee. I'd always meet really kind people as I stayed by my daddy's side. He'd always give my introduction as he stood there beaming with pride. Many of the people had no indoor plumbing, and most of them were all very poor. So my daddy would let them pay him with whatever it was they procure. Sometimes he took brown eggs or slab bacon, fresh vegetables, hams, and the like. All of this was so amazing to see for me as such a young tyke. The old women he'd always call young lady, but old and young all addressed him as sir. We'd make so many stops on our journey, I'm quite surprised that it's not all a blur. I remember learning about all these people and all the crops that they grew. Each time I'd learn something quite different. Each time I'd learn something quite new. My eyes would grow wide with the excitement as I saw all the animals in stock. We'd see so much beautiful scenery as we drive to our next door to knock. My dad had such a busy schedule, I can't imagine how he got it all done. All I remember is I loved tagging along, and all I remember is fun. Before integration, Mr. Partlow was one of the band leaders, and after integration also, when Carver was a 9th grade school. But on Fridays or game days, they would always practice and walk and go and march down Green Street. So it was such a big event. The people would close their stores up, everybody would come out on the sidewalks, and everybody would just listen and wait for Partlow's band to give us a show. So this poem is about Partlow's band. Though technically it was Carver High School Band, to one man it belonged. If you thought there was any other rule, then you'd be sorely wrong. On game days, we all knew the band would give a show. From the school, they'd make their start, and down Green Street they would go. First, we'd hear those mighty drums, and then the marching feet. The anticipation was so great as crowds lined along the street. The majorettes were a sight to see in glittering blue and gold, and little Gwen, who led the way, was maybe 9 years old. With batons twirling in the air and tassels wagging on their feet, there was always a special show for each corner crowd they'd meet. Each girl was stacked and well built, not a one of them was bony. They'd twist and turn and prance about, and Gwen would do the pony. Mr. Partlow, with head held high, would walk along the side. He'd strut like some male peacock with confidence and pride. Mr. Partlow has passed away, but history does repeat. His sons, Partlow's drummers, carry on the torch with each resounding beat. This poem is about the A.M. Strange Library. Before integration, we had a small little library on Green Street, which was called the A.M. Strange Library, and was named after Mr. A.M. Strange. He was the first principal of the Lee County Training School, which later became Carver High School before integration, and the school went from kindergarten, I believe, maybe to 12th grade, and we loved going to that little library. That little one-room library on North Green Street held a special place in our hearts. It was our neighborhood place to go for story hours, book reviews, and exposure to the arts. We'd sit at the little tables or formed circles on the floor. We were ready for some grand adventure each time we stepped in the door. Mrs. Vaughn, our wonderful librarian, was so soft-spoken, kind, and sweet. With a warm smile and welcoming voice, each child there she would greet. To many of us bookworms, it's where we got our start, and to my childhood love of reading, it played a very integral part.
Thank you, Mrs. Nealy-Dorsey. We all needed to learn a little bit more about our Mississippi history.
The sweet, sweet touch of heaven.
Historically black colleges, or as most know them as, HBCUs, have been prominent for hundreds of years. The first HBCU, Cheyney University of Pennsylvania, was founded in 1837. Since then, HBCUs have expanded across the nation with a total of 107 schools. Phyllis Sims is the Northeast Jackson State University alumni president, who is also a Tupelo native. She expresses her thoughts on why she thinks students should consider a HBCU after high school.
I think it's important, number one, for you to go to college, if that is what you really want to do. Some children might not have the aspiration or the desire to go to college. They might want to go to a junior college or technology school. That's great. The students that graduate from an HBCU, you can bet your bottom dollar they are prepared to go out into the world and do anything.
Ms. Ritchie is a graduate of Alcorn State University. She says that the experience of the colleges is why students should consider HBCUs after high school.
They're full of heritage, they're full of family traditions, They're full of academics, scholars. There's just so much history there, and the ratio, the teacher-student ratio is excellent, especially if you're looking for a smaller community. My biggest takeaway was I met one of my best instructors. Her name was Dr. Grace Prowl, and because I was away from home, she was just the best advisor. She helped me become who I am today as an educator. She took an interest in me, and I wasn't just a number, I was actually a student, and you find that really unique at HBCUs.
Thank you for those thoughts. Now THS Voices will bring us another inspirational performance with Lift Up Your Voices. We hope you enjoyed this year's Black History program. Thank you to the Oren Dunn Museum for hosting us, and we appreciate the speakers who chose to be a part of our program. Thank you for joining us.
Come together, you and me, come together right now, for all the world to see. Come together, you and me, come together right now. There's joy in unity. Come together, you and me, come together